Okay, so right now we're going to be talking about chapter 7, the painting chapter. So we're following the drawing chapter, chapter 6. And obviously, we talked about things like receptive versus projective drawing. We also talked about reasons that people draw, such as creating a preliminary drawing for a final work of art, whether it's a painting or whatever. Also making notations or practice drawings or simply sketching just to record an idea or something that you've seen. And then, of course, we talked about drawing as a final product. So we also mentioned sketchbooks. We took a look at the drawing media, such as dry media and wet media. Of course, dry media including things like pencils, charcoal, chalk, pastels, etc. And then, of course, liquid media basically being ink. And then once we cross over into the gouache area, we're really talking about watercolor. So essentially, we're leading into the painting chapter here, which is perfect because painting is basically drawing with liquid media, but oftentimes paintings are began as a preliminary drawing. So painting and drawing, of course, go hand in hand. Painting is oftentimes seen as art in general. When people think of the term art, oftentimes they think a painting. And this is just simply a kind of primitive instinct that we have as humans that dated all the way back to the cave paintings made by humans, where pigment was applied to a surface, even if it was such a rudimentary surface as a rock cave wall. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the history chapters. But let's talk about what this chapter is going to entail. As far as tools and techniques, what is going to predict the process of painting basically boils down to the science behind it. If it is paint that's water based, of course, that's going to predict a lot about the painting techniques and tools that you're going to use. Now, if you're using oil based paints, wax based paints, etc., then that's going to differentiate between not only tools, techniques, and styles, but it's going to differentiate between the product that you actually see. So we'll talk a little bit about why painters, people who in the art world have chosen to paint as their medium of choice, why they may actually use a particular type of paint. Okay, let's talk about three important ingredients to start with. Three parts of paint that make the difference between things like acrylics, oils, tempera paint, watercolors, etc. Okay, so first we have the pigment, and that's one of those obvious vocab words that thankfully is easy to recognize because we already know what a pigment is. Pigment is color. That is the color that's provided, whether it's from the dirt in the ground, whether it's ink from a squid or mashed up blueberries, or even blood from animals is often used for pigmentation. So there's a variety of sources that we can attain natural pigments. And of course, we're in the age of synthetic products as well. So industrial revolution brought us this ability to be able to create pigments of any variety, brightness, any color, etc. So pigment is where our color is going to come from. Oftentimes that's going to be provided in powder form, again, depending on the type of paint. Now, the next thing you need to know is the binder. The binder is just exactly what it says. It's going to bind the pigment together in some type of viscous way that it can be applied as a liquid to a surface, whether it's a canvas or a wall or a wooden board, whatever. So the binder can be anything from oil to egg to synthetic materials. So anything that's going to actually act as the glue that holds that substance together. Now, the direct opposite of that is known as the vehicle. So that's what is going to dissolve that pigment, or it's going to thin it out. So while the binder is holding it together, what is going to break it apart is the vehicle. So for instance, if you have a water-based paint that's being held together with, let's say we're talking about egg tempera. So you're literally using, just like you would in baking, you're using an egg to bind the paint together. It's going to hold it together just like the egg holds the cake together, okay, in baking. Or if it's a synthetic material. If it is a water-based paint, then water can therefore liquefy it and enable that stickiness to break up. So if you add water to egg tempera paint, it's going to thin it out. I like to think of the term vehicle as it makes it go. Our vehicles make us go. They help us to get from one place to another. So in the same sense, the vehicle is what makes the paint get to a further place. Okay, so it thins it out. Whether it's if it's an oil-based paint, of course, to thin out oil paints, you can't use water because we've got to think about the science behind this. Oil and water don't mix. You can use things like paint thinner, turpentine, mineral spirits, etc. But that's going to thin the paint out, make it oftentimes even more translucent. And make it more spreadable. So we got to think about the science behind it mostly for this chapter. Now, first of all, let's think about what surface we're going to be painting on, because often that's going to dictate what type of paint we want to use, or vice versa. If you want to use a particular type of paint, you need to consider the surface. We never use watercolors on a wall. If you want to paint a mural outside, you got to think about that. You don't want a water-based paint, because what's going to happen? The rain's going to come down, the flood's coming up, that whole song is going to wash it away. So we have to think about the surface as it's applicable to the particular paint. Now, similarly, tempera paint being mixed from eggs is going to have a flaky texture. So you would never want to use a canvas which has a certain amount of flexibility. So you don't want to use anything that's going to cause that flakiness to, become disturbed or whatever. So oftentimes you have to think about that. Is it going to need to be on a wood surface? Is it a wall painting? Do we want it to be on a canvas so that we can transport it? We could take it off of that's the thing about why canvases were invented in the early pre-Renaissance, because you could actually remove those from the frame on which they were, roll them up, take them with you. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to talk about 6 different types of paint, and I want you to mostly pay attention to the science behind this. What is the vehicle? What is the binder? Okay, because that's what's going to predict the advantages or the disadvantages to these types of paints. So this is going to tell you why certain artists choose these particular paints to work in. And this may also tell you, if you were ever to become interested in painting, or if you're already interested in painting, why you might be attracted to one type of paint compared to the other. Okay, instead of just being interested in painting in general. Okay, so let's get specific here. First of all, we have watercolors. Of course, we've probably all participated in the use of watercolors from our elementary school days. We've all had those oval Crayola watercolor paint pans. And of course, we know the binder in this particular case is going to be a synthetic binder. And that's why we're going to be able to get these types of paints for such a reasonable price and availability. Okay, so we all know you can get these at the dollar store. So literally, these things are produced so cheaply and rapidly at such an available pace that this is why watercolors are most often used, especially in educational settings. If you're talking about, pre-K, elementary school, churches, VBS, or your child at home wants to paint, you go to Walmart, buy them the Crayola watercolor pans. Now, if we're talking about watercolor painting on a professional level, now, of